I don't think I need to particularly introduce myself. You all know me. I guess the only thing I wanted to say is that while I've got some counselling and therapeutic qualifications, I'm obviously not a registered therapist. And so the whole of this comes from much more of a coaching frame than a therapy frame. And obviously what we're trying to do is keep both ourselves and the people we're listening to safe as we set up whatever this service is going to look like. So some of it's skill based, some of it's thoughts about keeping people safe, scopes of practice. And I just kind of started off, I guess, with a little bit about what is listening, what are we even talking about, and why do we need to learn how to listen? Because surely everybody can just do that, right? Why do we need to learn how to do it? So challenge that a little bit, giving you some top tips, and then hopefully have some space for question and answers, an open frame at the end, just to catch up on whatever I haven't said clearly. So kind of strange question to start with, but what is listening and what isn't it, I guess? If you imagine trying to explain it to someone who had never heard of it, didn't know what being human was, how would you describe what listening is? And as I started to kind of research some of that theory and base behind it, it was very much more than just hearing. It's way more complicated than just physically hearing. Hearing's easy, we just do it by default as long as we have no hearing problems, but listening is a very different skill set. And I guess how I wanted to frame this whole session is we're not talking about two friends listening to each other here. What we're talking about is someone taking the role of a caring listener, and therefore it's not really an equal relationship. So whereas in a friendship, we might get away with talking over somebody or jumping in and telling them our experience or saying what we're thinking, this is quite different from that. And so I framed the whole session around that unequal listening relationship where you're going in as a formal listener or carer, which is just a little bit different. Now, I did a quick search on Google, and there's lots and lots. I found up to 18 different forms of listening. Some of them I just think are, does what it says on the tin. Really, really obvious. Attentive listening. You could guess that that is about being absolutely attentive to the person you're listening to. It means your attention is on them. And it means that, we got to tackle the biggest issue with listening as human beings is we listen to reply or to respond rather than to understand or really hear what's being said. And that's not a criticism, that is just normal humanity. The way we understand and process stuff in our brains is by taking it in, comparing it to something we already know, then we understand it and then we can respond back. So it's almost holding back that normal instinctive response to give our opinion back. Active listening, again, probably a common one. Comprehensive listening is going beyond, much more into a level of understanding rather than just listening for the sake of being interested. And I guess there are some of these that we're doing more than others. It doesn't really matter whether we understand what somebody is saying to us, as long as they feel that they've been heard and listened to. So we don't have to make decisions at the end of it. It's not like a workplace where we've then got to come up with an agreed way forward. Our role is there to listen and let them feel heard. Again, critical listening, you could guess what that means. It is about trying to find fault with, find the pros, find the cons. That's not what we're about here. Biased, I left on the list because I think it's just an awareness that we all have our own biases, and that whatever we hear through the filters of what we already know. And so just being aware that we are all biased and that whatever we hear is our version of what has been heard, and just being careful with that as we reflect it back to the person, especially if they happen to have a very different view to us. Therapeutic listening, again, we're not going into the realms of therapy here, but I threw it in as if people are signing up as listeners and they do have a therapeutic qualification, then they've got to think about which hat they're wearing in that conversation at the time, and whether or not they are doing any therapeutic component. For most of us, we won't be. Relationship, I thought, was an interesting one as well. I used to belong to the Sevenoaks Befriending Scheme in the UK, which was quite a formal listener carer scheme run by an amalgamation of churches. And we had quite a prescriptive ability to make relationship, if you like. We were given 6 sessions with somebody, and it was often people who had come out of hospital or mental health service who weren't quite ready to go it alone, and they were passed across to us as a listening group. We were all trained, and then we kind of got them to the point where they could either build relationships with other people or become independent. What was really interesting was many of the listeners got so involved and built relationships with those people that they then didn't want to stop being a befriender. They became a friend of that person and had to drop off the befriending scheme, because then they were no longer available to be paired with the next person that needed a listener. So just thinking consciously about what that means in terms of building a relationship. You're not necessarily there to build a long-term relationship with these people as a listener, and sometimes it happens naturally, and then you kind of have to renegotiate the role. Selective I left on there because I've got teenagers, some of you have got teenagers, and we know that selective listening happens quite often in teenagers, and we all knew what that one meant. I thought it was just a humorous add-on. I don't know if you saw this lady speak in Parliament in the UK this week. This is Priti Patel. She's the health minister, and this is her giving an apology. Now, I hope that you can hear the audio as she starts to speak. So I don't know if you could hear that. It's very soft, but what she said was, "I'm sorry if," was the first statement. I'm sorry if. I don't know what happens to you inside when you hear that word if, but it's almost like an excuse for, I'm sorry if I did something, but I don't think I did. She then double whammies the mistake by putting in a but. So I'm sorry if you don't think we provided the facilities you needed, but we're in the middle of a pandemic, and but, for anyone that isn't familiar with language and grammar in that way, negates everything that's gone before it. So she basically did a double, I'm not really sorry and I'm not really sorry, and she's come under huge criticism. So I threw that in that, you know, it has a question about, was she listening? Was she actually listening to the question that was asked? And was she listening to the wider population who clearly felt that she owed an apology? She was almost kind of forced into the position of giving an apology, and did it in such a way that it was what it's been in the headlines in the news is a non-apology. So it's not only about what we say, it is, you know, the how we say it and the context within which we say it as well, that we're listening for as we listening to other people. But while we're then replying back, we need to be conscious of what might be heard from what we say. Okay, as if that wasn't complicated enough, if you start looking at the theory of listening, there are also different stages of listening. Now, I've added preparation onto the front, and I threw this in very deliberately because I think the point at which you start receiving the words from the other person is actually not the starting point, and especially for us as listeners and carers. So for me, there was a large part about preparation that needed to be done as well. So the obvious one, in terms of us prayerfully putting that person before the Lord, putting ourselves before the Lord before we even pick up the phone and make the call. Preparation in terms of finding quiet space so that you would be undisturbed. Preparation about what your intention is on that call, and being very clear about that before you start the call with them, so that again, it's not that equal relationship of ringing a friend. You are kind of facilitating the listening process. You're guiding them in a certain way. If they start to get deep into some difficult emotion or distress or story, as a listener, it would be really healthy and good to be able to negotiate them back onto some neutral territory. Not that it's not okay for them to show emotion, but you don't want to leave them in that depth of negative emotion when you put the phone down at the end of the call. So this model comes from Joseph DeVito. He says it starts at receiving. And even with that one, he says there's an intentional focus on hearing a speaker's message. So once you're in that conversation with someone, there is a sense of turning all your attention on them and what they're saying. You're going to be filtering out other noises. Obviously, there's an element of hearing ability. If there's a problem with the phone line, if there's a problem with accents, if there's something with your, you know, hearing ability, then all of those practical things need to be sorted out in order that you can even receive the conversation as it's happening. Stage 2, he says, is understanding. And this is when naturally, as we hear things, we take it inside of us, compare it to what we already know in order that we can make meaning of it. And if somebody says something to you where there is no reference structure at all inside of you, you'll struggle to understand that. And depending who rings us or who we end up ringing, there could well be times when they're talking about things we have no experience of. I know that I talk for myself, and I'm sure I'm kind of okay saying this for most of us who are listed as listeners. We're in quite a privileged way of being and way of living. And there may well be lots of things that people bring into these calls that are outside of our experience and our awareness. And so our understanding may be compromised by that. Remembering is what he has as the next one. If you haven't heard it and you haven't understood it, it's almost impossible to remember what's been said. And why do we need to remember? So that we can enter into conversation and have an intelligent conversation about it. I don't know if you're aware of some of the, again, theoretical work behind this. Miller did some kind of studies on how much can we remember. And basically it's 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So if I just start to read out a list of fruits for you to remember: apple, orange, satsuma, pear, grape, banana, plum, peach, nectarine, you will already be beginning to go, what was the first one? I've forgotten, because I've gone beyond that limit of the 7 plus or minus 2. But if I were to give you that list and ask you to remember it, and you could find a way of categorizing them, so you might say, well, let me just do the orange ones. That's an orange and a satsuma. They're orange in color. Because you can cut them into chunks by color, so you could do orange and green, yellow and red. There's only 4 chunks to remember. And then within each of those chunks, you can go, well, which were the green ones? Well, that was the apple, the pear, the grape. Then you're far more likely to remember. So just being aware, both in terms of what you're listening and trying to understand, if they start to get really distracted and go, and then this, and then that, oh, and then there was, and then this, don't expect to be able to keep track of all of that, because the human mind doesn't work that way. And maybe begin to step back from what they're saying and group it. There are lots of these examples around stress, a lot of these examples around relationship, and if you can group them, you're far more likely to be able to remember enough that then you can feed back to them and have a conversation and show that you've really been listening. His 4th stage is evaluating. Now, again, not too much of an issue for us, because whether or not we agree with someone isn't really the issue here. We're there as a listening service, and I'm sure there'll be lots of things that come into that sphere that we don't necessarily agree with or even think are right to be being done. But it will be natural that we have some form of judgment or evaluation filter running. And then stage 5 of the listening is giving feedback. And if you haven't gone through those stages, it's very difficult then to enter into that feedback conversation where it's back and forth. So I thought it was interesting to break it into stages. And when you look at that and you think of all the different parts of that that could go wrong, it's not surprising that sometimes we get listening, at a real substandard level. So whatever we can do to enhance each of those stages will help us have a really good listening conversation with someone. I found this model of whole body listening, and I just thought it was really interesting in the light of what I do outside of this work in terms of multiple braining and working with the somatic body, and that they linked that to listening. Now, if I'd said to you, which organ do you listen with? I'm guessing most people would have said ears. But when you look at all the different ways that you can listen and show you're listening, it kind of opens the whole field right up. Eyes are a really good connection into what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. It's part of our ventral vagal system, or voice, face, heart circuit. And so how we look at somebody is really key. And I guess you're going to be saying, but this is going to be on a phone. They're not necessarily going to be able to see me. But know that how your eyes are affect that nervous system, whether or not someone can see you. So if you're smiling with your eyes, they will sense that through the change of the tone of voice, the pace of voice, the depth of voice, even if they can't see your eyes. So one of the things, really good tip is before you pick up that phone, you've prayed for the person, you've prayed for the conversation, and you just smile with your eyes and your face fully before you make that call, and it could totally change the trajectory of the whole conversation. Ears, I thought I'd throw in just a throwaway comment, really, in that depending which ear you speak in, you get a different response from someone. So there is an ear that is more likely to get compliance. So think about which side you use the phone on. And if somebody is very much in a stressed or agitated state, you might want to move the phone to your right side to help you get back to some form of balance. Likewise, if somebody is going into a very apathetic, withdrawn down side, take the phone to the left ear, and you're more likely to bring up your energy into the sympathetic nervous space, and that will then effectively be contagious for them. Mouth with listening is interesting because it's really about not talking rather than using the mouth for talking, and that any listening service is, you know, if you played back a call, you want the vast majority of the conversation to be from the other person, really with you just giving encouraging kind of yes, no, tell me more, that's really fascinating, rather than you becoming the person that's doing all the talking and them listening to you. As I say again, this is not an equal relationship. This is you giving them space to express and to talk fully. And it might be the only place they've had that week to actually do that. So many people don't feel listened to, don't feel that they belong, that you're giving them an enormous gift by just being quiet on the phone. Hands and feet, another good indicator that if you're fidgeting with hands and feet, that your stress nervous system might be running higher than a balance point. And so that beautiful balanced breathing that I talked about in the last little video that we did together can be a way of you bringing yourself back to balance, so that you're not fidgeting. While you might feel that that's on a phone, they can't see it, they will sense it, they will pick up which side of that autonomic balance you're on. Again, with the body, if you're not face to face with someone, then that's you know, kind of less relevant. But if we do get to the point where this rolls out as a service that we provide in person, literally how you sit with someone, whether you're facing them, whether you're turned to them, whether you're directly on face to face, all makes a difference to how effectively you can listen. The brain is probably, the head brain is probably the biggest one in terms of a distractor, because our head brains go off on all sorts of other thinking, what you should be doing, what you could be doing, whether or not you can just check your diary while you're on the call, whether or not you can just check whatever. So finding a way to quieten that brain down for you as a listener is really key. And whenever you are distracted, just coming back again with that breathing, with some of the techniques that we talked about, like yawning, or using that little globule of oil behind the front teeth to stop the brain chatter, so that you can give them your whole attention. And again, as an M-brainer, having the heart there and listening with the heart, I just thought was a lovely match to what I do outside, that your heart is a brain in its own right, it has intelligence, and bring that into the conversation, connect at a heart level. So I'm guessing you've all had experience of when listening goes really well and you walk away and you think that was just amazing. You know, I really feel listened to, I feel cared for. And I guess there are times when you've had whole conversations and felt like you've not been listened to in any way. Now, I'm a little bit nervous about the volume on this one, judging by the last one. You might be aware of Inside Out. I hope you can hear it, but if not, that's still a good kind of exercise in listening. Watch the kind of body language, watch the facial gestures, and even if you can't hear the word, it's about a 2.5-3 minute clip, it's not very long, and this is, you know, mum and dad over a table having a conversation with the girl they've just moved. So it's about, you know, what's going on. She doesn't quite seem herself after this move.
Turns out the green trash can is not recycling. It's for greens, like compost and eggshells. And the blue one is recycling. And the black one.
Riley is acting so weird. Why is she acting so weird?
What do you expect? All the islands are down.
Joy would know what to do.
That's it. Until she gets back, we just do what Joy would do.
Great idea. Anger, fear, disgust. How are we supposed to be happy?
Hey, Riley, Good news. I found a junior hockey league right here in San Francisco, and get this, tryouts are tomorrow after school. What luck, right?
Hockey.
Uh-oh, what do we do?
Guys, here, you pretend to be Joy.
Won't it be great to be back out on the ice?
Oh yeah, that sounds fantastic.
What was that? That wasn't anything like Joy.
Because I'm not Joy?
Yeah, no kidding.
Did you guys pick up on that?
Did. Something's wrong. Should we ask her?
Let's probe, but keep it subtle so she doesn't notice. So, how was the first day of school?
She's probing us.
I'm done. You pretend to be Joy.
What? Okay.
It was fine, I guess. I don't know. Oh, very smooth. That was just like Joy.
Something is definitely going on.
She's never acted like this before. What should we do? We're gonna find out what's happening, but we'll need support. Signal the husband.
With a nice pass over the reed, comes across the right.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
What? Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What? What is it, woman? What?
He's making that stupid face again.
I could strangle him right now.
Signal him again.
Ah, so, Riley, how was school?
Are you kidding me?
For this, we gave up that Brazilian helicopter pilot?
Boo! I'll be Joy.
School was great, all right?
Riley, is everything okay?
Sir, she just rolled her eyes at us.
What is her deal? All right, make a show of force. I don't want to have to put the foot down.
No, not the foot. Riley, I do not like this new attitude.
Oh, I'll show you attitude. No. Stay happy!
What is your problem? Just leave me alone.
Sir, reporting high levels of sass.
Take it to DEFCON 2.
You heard that, gentlemen? DEFCON 2. Listen, young lady, I don't know where this disrespectful attitude came from.
You want a piece of this, Pops? Come and get it!
Yeah, well...
Here it comes. Prepare the foot.
Keys to safety position. Ready to launch on your command, sir.
Just shut up!
Fire!
That's it. Go to your room. Now. Foot is down. The foot is down.
Good job, gentlemen. That could have been a disaster.
So she says that could have been a disaster, and then the lady says it was a disaster. Simple lack of listening across the table, very simple escalation of things to the point that she storms off and he puts his foot down and she storms off. So I thought it was kind of a nice way of leading into why is listening important. The risk of not listening is you end up with complete misunderstanding. Everybody's got their own stuff going on in their head, hearing different stories, making different meanings, and then you end up in, full-on arguments and conflict. Hopefully that's not going to happen in any listening conversation, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that if you got distracted or you let that head talk go off on one, that you could lose rapport with the person you're listening to and them just feel like they're not being listened to, and they go, oh, okay, I've got to go now. I've got to go and do X, Y, and Z, put the meal on or go and pick the kids up, and they just disconnect from us. So why is listening important then? I thought we could come up with some really, really easy reasons for why I believe this is such a key role for any group of people. And I just think it's absolutely lovely that we're pushing it out through the church. One is that we are social creatures by nature. We need to be in relationship. We need to feel that we belong. And an awful lot of people, the research is showing, are not feeling like they belong anywhere. So this could be the most beautiful gift we give to people in the community. As if that's not enough, that's a headline from Forbes magazine a couple of years ago now. Loneliness is a great health risk, maybe bigger than smoking or obesity. So it is a serious issue, a health issue that we could be linking into and reducing the problems of. And The Guardian wrote last year, loneliness is not just in older people. So if we're sat there thinking that the sort of person who's going to ring is only going to be the older person that lives on their own, that's not the case. That the loneliness figures are going up across all age ranges and even across people who are in family units. So loneliness isn't really about being in solitude or being alone. It's a state of mind, and you can be in a crowded room and feel disconnected and lonely. Studies are showing, as I said, that people are becoming more lonely, feeling more lonely, and having less friends over time. It's said that having just 3 or 4 close friends is enough to ward off loneliness and reduce the negative health consequences. So being an active listener, you could very much play the role of one of those friends, helping them be listened to, which is a quarter of their way back to good health. So hence I get kind of excited about this stuff and really think it's key within a community setting. So we know people crave contact. Maslow's hierarchy used to have social needs up at a 3rd level. There's now a few social psychologists putting it right down the bottom as a basic need, with food, safety and shelter, that human connection is a need, not a nice to have. Okay, I started looking up some of the Christian literature and saying, within our Christian frame of reference, why is listening important? And I found this lovely article by David Mathis on a site called desiringgod.org. And he said, listening is an act of love. And I thought, what a beautiful reason to provide a listening service, that it is an active way of showing love within the community. To give a couple of quotes of his, he said, just as love to God begins with listening to his word, so the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. So we start from love, and that comes back to my comment about our listening service starts way before we make that call. It's part of the preparation and coming from that heart space to truly connect with someone, and to listen as an act of love will come from heart. He also says listening is a form of ministry. There will be days when the most important ministry we do is square our shoulders to some hurting person, uncross our arms, lean forward, make eye contact, and hear their pain all the way to the bottom. And I thought that was a beautiful, again, a beautiful reason, as if we need a reason for saying why this whole listening service that we're providing is really key. Okay. Being human, lots of people want to know what's in it for me as well. And I thought this was interesting that, again, from this same Mathis article, he said, good listening reflects our relationship with God. So it's a chance for us to reflect. Let me just read out the whole quote behind that. He who can no longer listen to his brother will soon be no longer listening to God either. He'll be doing nothing but prattle in the presence of God too. This is the beginning of the death of the spiritual life. Anyone who thinks that his time is too valuable to spend keeping quiet will eventually have no time for God and his brother, but only for himself and for his follies. So it just kind of links in with what I've already said, that listening is often about being quiet, and that if you're coming from that place of love, then it's way bigger than just our love for that person. It's also our relationship with God, and can we sit quietly and listen to God in the moments when we're on our own with him. On the plus side, there are all sorts of benefits for us being a listener. Lowering our blood pressure, increasing self-esteem, lowering stress, living longer, increasing happiness. So it's not just for the other person. Any acts of service, any giving have almost more benefits for us as the giver. It's not why we do it, but it is good to know that it's good for you as well to be an active listener with other people. I looked up some Bible verses too, to go, what does the word listen appear? How often does it appear? What does it appear in? And I picked out these 3. Again, this first one in Proverbs, really back to that whole sense of what listening in. Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions. That if all we're doing is listening in order to say what we think, how we've done that before, or we know all about that, or we know someone who's done that, or whatever, if we're not actually listening, then we're a fool, basically, according to Proverbs. He who has ears, let him hear. That's a fairly straight commandment. I know it's slightly out of context in terms of listening to other people, but in the light of that Mathis article, I started to go, well, actually, if we're also, by listening to other people, also listening to God, actually it's not as out of context as it might appear to be. and that we should be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. But those first two, again, just really reiterates this is not about us having a voice and speaking, it's about us hearing and giving the other person the voice. Okay, so we kind of know what listening is and what it isn't and some of the basics of it, and I'll share some of the tips in a minute, but I thought it was worth us also being really clear what listening in this context isn't. And we're certainly not qualified to be picking up clinical issues. So if someone is talking about clinical depression, if there's any sense that within the conversation they're at risk of harming themselves or others, or they talk about having a mental health condition that looks like it's either becoming unstable or escalating, then we have to know who to pass them across to. And that might be as simple as getting them to phone the GP, or they might have a therapist they're already in touch with. Obviously, if you're seriously concerned in that moment, then it is a case of calling an ambulance or some first responder type help. And I think we need to think about what numbers we have on hand. I've picked out a few there. There may be others where we've got some pretty good backup, or we can pass these people on to more qualified therapeutic support when it goes beyond our listening ability. And then I thought, because I'm biased, because I come from that clinical realm, I thought there are other issues too that people may raise that we just have to say, actually, this is not our place to give advice on. And we're not there to give legal advice or financial advice. We're just not qualified to do that. I put the at risk as well, because with all the conversations about domestic violence going up and child abuse issues being so high in New Zealand, there could be, it's not beyond the realms of possibility, that something of that came in the call. And we just need to know to ring the police straight away with that and pass it on and not try and deal with it at our level. So we're listeners, we're not therapists, we're not lawyers, we're not financial advisors, and we're certainly not the police. And I'm guessing that Simon and Steve will be looking at that in terms of what backup numbers we have available to hand very quickly, that when we start to do these calls in any number, we know exactly where to refer people onto if we need to. We don't try and handle something outside of our own scope of practice. Okay, so my top tips, and they're not exhaustive by any stretch, but just 7 that I've kind of come up with. First one is related to this whole issue of we listen to reply and not to understand. And it is one of the biggest issues in communication in any context, relationship, in work. Our temptation is just to jump in. So how do we avoid doing that? One is about being really clear on the intention of what the call is about and setting aside time so that you absolutely put your focus, your intention and attention on the person that you're calling. Pray before you make the call. Commit them to God, commit yourself to God, commit the whole conversation to God's keeping, and bring God into that conversation with you. Whenever you get that sense of wanting to jump in and respond or reply, just pause. And it might be a simple out breath, but just pause. And just ask yourself what the purpose of that responding is. Is it to have your say, to give your view, or is it to encourage them to say more? And if it's about you, it might be a case of literally stopping the question or the comment that was about to come out, keeping your attention on them and asking them some just encouraging prompt. Tell me more about that. That's fascinating, really interesting. Can you tell me more? Don't interrupt or talk over them. That's again something you can get away with someone you know really well. But if you're there as a listener, you certainly don't want to be talking over the top of them. Always let them finish what they're saying. Be completely comfortable to have a moment of silence. And if you're coming from that heart space, that will feel completely okay. It won't be an awkward silence. And just make sure they really have finished speaking. And if you do get to the point where there really is nothing else that is coming up from them, have a few kind of key questions up your sleeve to start the conversation going again. And I've got some suggestions for that down the line. In order for you to do all of that, you do need your attention wholly and utterly on the other person, and to be in a place where you're not distracted by other stuff going on. Here's some of the questions I just kind of went through a few sites about having conversations. It would just be a case of having one or two ready up your sleeve. I like these. There was a whole load of them. I don't know which one you kind of resonate with. You know, what's the funniest thing that's ever happened to you? If you could describe yourself in 3 words, what would they be? They're just kind of conversation starters. Not everybody is comfortable and finds it easy to have conversations with strangers. And when that conversation comes to a close, it's about how do you start it up again in an easy way. The other thing I thought some of these were really good for was if people are getting stuck in everything that's going wrong and you wouldn't believe how awful life is and this has happened and that's happened, just to try to, having listened to that, but to try to come around to a more positive conversation before you let the call end, so that you leave them on in a better place, basically. So it was just some examples I came up with. Okay, number 2, be in the right state. Now, this you'll recognize if you've done any of my stuff before on stress or looking after yourself. How you breathe absolutely impacts on your autonomic nervous system, and that determines the state or the emotional kind of management frame that you're in. And a very simple balanced breathing with an even breath in and out, deep breaths into your tummy, puts you into what we call a calm alert phase. It's not about relaxation, but it is a calm state, but you're totally and utterly alert and wide awake. You can hold a positive emotion at heart level while you're doing that. And this word entrainment is all about the fact that those states are contagious. So if you are frustrated, embarrassed, irritable, any of those negative states, you will pull people into that as well. So what you want to do is make sure that you're holding a positive entrainment of compassion or appreciation, gratitude. And all I would say is it's worth, while you're doing your prayer before you get on the call, doing a couple of minutes in prayer, in this balanced breathing, holding compassion for that person that you're just about to call. And you'll absolutely make sure, 1, you protect yourself, that you're not sucked into any negativity that they're doing, and 2, you're giving them a favor by kind of injecting them with some positive energy in the middle of the call. Okay, mind your language. We looked at Priti Patel giving that non-apology. You know, simple words can be incredibly powerful. So being really conscious about what words we bring into the conversation, even if it's not intentional, so that they're not heard from the other party in any unhelpful way. Always use their words as well. So if someone says, oh, it's been a really tough week, I'm so fed up, and you say, oh, so you're feeling a bit depressed, they go, no, it's just been a tough week. I didn't say I was depressed. I didn't use the word depressed. In fact, I find the word depressed quite offensive. You're calling me depressed. That makes me X, Y, and Z. I'm going to go off the call now. And suddenly we're into that whole thing over the dinner table where there's a complete misunderstanding just because of the wrong use of one word. So always using their words, reflecting back to let them know that you've heard. And then there's some really cheeky, powerful words that you can learn to be aware of in both good and bad ways. So one of the ones that came up with Priti Patel was the word but. And the minute you say but, you negate everything that's gone before. So if you say to someone, oh, I hear you, but, they immediately think you're dismissing what you've just told them. So much, much better to replace that word with the word and. I hear you and. So if you're trying to switch them from negative to positive, I hear you and. How else could we look at that? What else might that have meant? What else might that person have meant? Whatever, you can turn them into a positive with an and word. I'm guessing that some of the stuff we'll get is a sense of lack of control, maybe hopelessness in terms of, you know, being stuck in a lockdown. And so the word yet can be useful. So if they're, oh, but I haven't got this yet. Oh, but I can't do this yet. So when you reflect it back by putting the word yet on the end of the sentence, you're absolutely using their words. They know you've heard, and you're opening up that sense of hope that it might come somewhere down the line, or it will come. The presupposition is it will come. It just hasn't happened yet. So get familiar with a few key words, when to use them, when not to use them. The last one I put in, I guess this is a bit of a bugbear for me. You all know my name is Suzanne. the number of times I go into organizations or training rooms and people call me Susan. And for me, it's a completely different name. It's like they're not talking to me. I don't relate to it. So I really encourage you to be absolutely clear with what their name is, how they want to be addressed, how they like to be called. You know, for me, is it Susan, Suzanne, Susie, Mrs. Henwood, Dr. Henwood, whatever. Just to kind of set that up right at the beginning means that you can go through the whole conversation with that respectful, in their map of the world, how they want to be referred to, and they'll relate to you much easier because you're using the name that they like to use. Okay, double dipping. This is a lovely one. I think I use this in the youth service. So, you know, you're ringing someone up, they've rung through to the service line to say they're having a hard time. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that one of your first questions will be, how are you doing? Or are you okay? Now, if I were to ask you that right now, I'm guessing some of you would say, yeah, fine. Yeah, all right. And it's kind of a dismissive, it doesn't necessarily reflect what they're really feeling or how they're doing, but we're trained into just giving that dismissive answer. Yeah, I'm all right. The double dipping is if you go back in and ask again with a bit of an emphasis on really, so how are you really, or are you really okay? It can really open up the conversation and let them know that you genuinely want to know. It wasn't a dismissive, are you okay, that you might do when you're passing someone in the street. You actually want to know the answer and you give them space to talk as freely as they can. So I love double dipping. It's incredibly easy and it just stops them being able to hide really behind that fine word or okay word. Okay, using the F word, by that I mean feelings. As a listener, it's good to know that we have about 3,600 emotions as human beings, and the majority of people work, if on a good day, for around 12 emotions that they're aware of. So getting people to be able to speak about how they truly feel can be really helpful. This is just one of there's tables of emotions. This is Plutnik's wheel of emotion. There's all sorts of different ways of encouraging it. But just why I've put it here is to be okay with them talking about emotions, even if it means they get upset, even if it means they cry. That's okay. Hold the space for them. Let them express it. And then with that beautiful and word, kind of redirect them towards the end of the conversation to becoming a more positive conversation. But I threw it in, be okay with emotions. If you're someone that struggles to talk about emotions more, just think about how you're going to do that if someone does raise emotions on the call with you. The worst thing you can kind of do is try to shut it off straight away, that it's not okay to express that they're sad or angry or whatever the feeling is, but actually just saying that's okay, even just that phrase, that's okay. And if the emotion is not played with by our head-based thinking, emotions pass in 90 seconds. So holding the space just for 90 seconds, saying it's okay. The only reason they last longer is when we start to get involved with them and we start to put the thinking behind it and the story and the meaning behind it. Then we can, it's like throwing coals on a fire, we can ramp that up and keep the feelings there for a lot longer. Slow down. A reminder, there's no agenda for this call that we're making other than we're connecting with somebody. There's nothing we have to get discussed. There's nothing we have to do. It is just a check-in. And so genuinely giving them space to talk about whatever they want to talk about at whatever pace they want to talk is the biggest gift that you can give them. So don't be clock watching. Don't be kind of setting yourself, oh, you've had my 3 minutes, I'm going to go now, because they'll feel that. Genuinely let them talk. And, you know, ask anything else. And what else? And how else? So encourage them to talk and slow right down. Hopefully they'll talk slow right down as well. I was trying to think, what frame of mind do I have to come from in order to do that? And the word curiosity came to my mind more than anything else. That whatever they decide to talk to you about, if I'm curious about it, I can then find another question. Tell me more about that, because I'm curious. And that shows respect. It shows they're accepted. It shows they're safe. They can talk about anything. And it will feel like that privilege of the health benefit to you for having listened. Because the reality is we're going to get people talking to us about stuff we're not particularly interested in, maybe don't know anything about. And so we've got to keep that level of interest up. And the last one, have fun. That actually, I talked about starting with a smile, because you hear that in your tone of your voice, but actually using appropriate humor throughout the call as well. I looked up some figures. I haven't got the figures on there. Oh, there I have. So a 4-year-old laughs on average 300 times a day. 300 times a day. An average 40-year-old laughs only 4 times a day. And many of you know that I'm part of the embraining field, and Grant had pancreatic cancer, and I went over and spent a week with him before he died to pick up a lot of the business side of embraining. And one morning his wife and I were in the kitchen doing something mundane. We were washing dishes or something. And we didn't realize he'd got up, and he was stood in the kitchen door kind of looking at us. And I didn't even think about it. I was just being me. And Grant kind of interrupted and said to me, "You laugh a lot." And I almost felt guilty. I'm in a dying man's house. And he said, "I laugh a lot." And I kind of apologized. I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't know you were awake." And he said, "No, please don't apologize." He said, "We've kind of forgotten how to laugh here. It's really lovely to hear laughter in the house." And so appropriate use of humor, be okay to laugh with the people that you're listening to. Encourage them to laugh if you can. It's probably one of the best kind of therapeutic outcomes that you could have from a listening call. Obviously, it's got to be appropriate. Okay, I'm almost wary of, I think I might not even play this because the sound is so bad without that extra speaker attached. But if you look up this clip from Big Bang, Sheldon, as we know, is probably on the spectrum, and his inability to listen, and it's all about him. They end up having a conversation across a table using a chess timer. And so both of them are pushing this chess timer to kind of take over control of the call again. And it's just a funny skit about clearly they're not listening to each other. It is all about them just having their say. That's the whole focus of the call. They're really not listening to each other at all, and it's done in a very humorous way. So if you do a Google search on Big Bang and listening, you'll be able to find that clip really quickly. It's only a couple of minutes, be worth just finding. Oh, and it's playing anywhere. Okay, so what do I think we've covered? And hopefully, we'll open it up for questions. But listening, way more complex than hearing, and that we listen with a lot more than our ears. So we need to purposefully and consciously engage way more than our ears when we go into that listening call. Listening makes them feel better, and it makes us feel better when it's done well. And so being really clear about the intention and purposeful nature of that and what you're doing as a listener in this context. It comes from love, therefore it comes from heart, and it is a form of ministry that we can be provided. Set yourself up with prayer beforehand and pray for those people afterwards. And we need to absolutely make sure that we keep us safe and them safe by being really clear on the parameters of what we can do and can't do within those conversations, and when we need to hand them on and who we hand them on to. In terms of the tip, we talked about listening purposefully, setting yourself up for success, being in that right state by managing your own autonomic nervous system, being really conscious of any language you use and how it can be misconstrued, even when the intention was never to cause misunderstanding. That double dipping to go into a deeper level of, are you really okay? Using feelings and being okay with allowing them to use feelings in the conversation. Slowing down enormously and not thinking there's anything you need to get done here. All you need to get done is to make the other person feel that they've been seen and heard. That's the only focus of the whole call. And have fun and let them re-engage with fun and enjoyment. So I'm going to stop that, come back to the call and open it up if anyone's got any questions.
That was really good, Suzanne. I ended up writing quite a lot. Although hopefully we'll be able to look over the notes a bit later again. There's so much in it, which was really good. Challenging things too. I think I talk too much.
Which, when you're with someone on an equal relationship, is fine, because you're excited to share what you want to share and they're excited what they want to share, and you can do that. And I guess what I wanted to get across is when you're there as a listener, it is a very different relationship.
Yeah. I think I've excused it in a way by feeling like I need to respond back to show that I'm listening.
Yeah.
But it was really good what you had to say.
Actually, Siobhan, that touched on, you meant what you just said there touched on something that I was thinking, because, you know, sometimes you're in a conversation with a person and there's a lot of negative emotions, and to just sit in silence almost feels unempathetic. So my empathetic response is, gee, so when that person did that to you, I can see why that may make you feel mad. You bet it made me feel mad, and off they go again on the next run. So the counterintuitive idea of just sitting and listening, so that the emotion, kind of negative emotions, almost like run out of steam, whereas being empathetic in that context is actually kind of feeding more fuel into the fire, isn't it?
Well, it is a balance, because whether or not you're asking questions that puts them into story, or they just carry on telling the story, what you're doing by going over an old story is rewiring that negative pathway. So the ideal is you want to move them off of that old story. But if you try and move them too quickly and they don't feel that you've understood and heard them, they won't be happy to move on.
Yes.
So it's at what point do you feel like they've expressed it sufficiently that you can try to gently move them on to something a little bit more positive, rather than, bearing in mind, this is going to be a biased audience, right? This is going to be people who have come to us because they're feeling unhappy. So they're going to be in that negative space, which is why getting ourselves in the right state before we have those conversations is so key, because otherwise we're going to get sucked into their negativity.
So what would be an example then, Suzanne? So let's say a person's had a little 5-minute diatribe and you've sat and listened, and you sense it's time to turn the conversation away from the negative stream. What question or thought flow would you inject into the conversation at that point?
Yeah, so this is where I would kind of almost go into my coaching background. So I might say something like, you know, I hear that's been really difficult for you, and I just wonder, you know, what would it be like if, and then put some positive different frame in place. Because just imagining the positive still fires up the same neural networks as if it was happening in real life. So any question that would get them to imagine either what they want or what it could be like, or if that wasn't true, you know, that person really hates me. They're causing my life, they're making it so difficult for me. Wow, I hear that. What if? What if they didn't? What if somewhere down the line, you know, that wasn't true? Just to help them pattern interrupt, to kind of go the other way. And clearly, you know, I'm not trying to suggest that you're all going to be in a coaching frame. So it is just a listening frame. You're not trying to intervene as such. That's a whole different level of kind of training. But some simple questions of what if can be really powerful.
One of the things I had first time I spoke to a lady that I'm talking to, I actually asked her where she lived just to get conversation. And I happened to mention someone I knew. I said, oh, do you know so-and-so? And straight away she went, oh. And so I then said to her, I want you to know that everything that goes in this conversation is confidential, and it strictly won't go past our conversation. And I realized sometimes it's actually quite important to make sure they understand that confidentiality.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we could create perhaps a paragraph up front that we just say verbally about that. This is what we are, this is what we're not, this is what we're offering, and these are kind of the frameworks that we sit within. and that we could have either a set little piece that's either we read it off at the start of the conversation, or that depending on the connection with the person, we could send to them. But I think it's a really great point, especially if we're looking at, you know, Laingholm, Parao, Titirangi. Chances are people are going to know each other. And even if you don't say names, if one of these people was describing a family context or situation, you might still guess at who they're talking about. So yeah, I think you know, whatever we can do to protect ourselves and them in that, and know that this is completely and utterly confidential, unless.
Oh, and I did say that, unless I felt, and then I would be contacting, you know.
Yeah.
Your name, actually.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that again takes it away from this kind of friendship conversation and putting it in a slightly more formal structure, so that they're very aware what the parameters of it are and aren't, and what our requirements are in terms of referring them on, or at what point would you literally call the police if you're worried about a safety issue, or call the GP there and then if someone, you know, if someone is talking about harming themselves. Now, I did some training a while back, solution focused brief therapy for severe stress and anxiety. And one of the things shocked me, because I'm there as a coach, right? I'm not there as a therapist. And a lot of the people in the room were even less trained than me. And the guy said, if you think there's somebody else outside this room that's more trained to handle someone who declares that they're going to take their own life, you're fooling yourself. You're it in that moment. And it was quite a challenge to me, because I would have always said, well, I would just refer on to a psychotherapist or whatever. But he said it might be that you're the only person they tell. And so being okay to ask that question, have you had thoughts about harming yourself? And if they say yes, you've generated that conversation, but you absolutely know then you need to get additional support in. So kind of not being frightened to scoot around that issue, that if you are worried that someone is at risk, just have the confidence to ask that question outright. And then if there's any sense that the answer is yes, I think what we need are some local numbers of either psychotherapists that know what we're doing, that are, you know, happy to take referrals, or counsellors or GP practices or whatever, that we have ready. Every listener has their ready that can pass them straight on. Because again, it's a biased audience. These are people who are already struggling. That's why they've rung the number. I guess the other side of that for me is about being aware of what are the services they're already using. So one of the ladies that rang me the other day, she said, I can't get hold of my counsellor. So immediately I know she's already in a counselling relationship with somebody else. So my priority then was to help her to get hold of her counsellor, rather than me interfere with that relationship.
Can I just ask another question? You know that statement, how are you feeling really?
Yeah.
When someone says that to me, I always feel slightly insulted.
Oh, say more.
Because for me, the subscript to that statement is, you're holding out on me and you don't trust me enough to tell me the whole story. So how are you feeling really? Because you told me the superficial stuff, but I'm going to just hang here until you really spill the beans.
So I guess it's, how could you ask it in a different way that gets the intention across, that opens up the invitation, if you want to say more, you can, without it feeling insulting or pushy.
Yeah.
What would be a different way for you? So if I said to you, hey, Simon, how are you doing? And you went, yeah, all right. And I go, really all right? Or just polite all right?
Yeah.
So it would be a way of, how do you reframe that question that just says to them, look, I am genuine, I want to know. And if you want to talk to me, you know, I really do want to listen, but still not pushing, because you're right. Some people might not want to talk at any depth, and that's okay too. I don't know if that helps. No,
it does. I suppose the one of, you know, the question like, you know, you're really all right, is that just a polite response? That's a much slower process, because you have to kind of work your way through the network of defences to sort of get to it, possibly, yeah, you're gonna like now it's a multi-question. So
and there has just been this years of socialization of the expected answer being, yeah, fine.
yeah, no, that's right.
But yeah, it doesn't have to be those exact words. The principle is to go back in for another check.
Yes.
Not just take that first answer, because if
Sure.
you know, if you ring them up and you say, how are you doing, and they go fine, well, that's a pretty quick listener call, isn't it?
That's right.
We could get through quite a few of those in an hour, but
Well,
the fact that
I have two other questions in my repertoire that I think is quite useful. One is what's happening in your life right now that would be important for me to know? So they're still in control of what they talk about. But now we want to talk about what's important, because they could be talking about the weather and how they feel about Donald Trump and the fact that the cat just spilt their milk, you know. But that's one question, I suppose. And the other question that I have, particularly after a person's done this big sort of talk thing, is to ask, what's the most important thing in what you've just told me? Because generally what I find that does, then that will often move them away from facts and opinions down to thoughts and feelings. What's the most important thing in what you just told me?
Yeah, I mean, I again, it comes back to what is, you know, this, the chances are this is someone we don't know, so it's effectively a stranger on the line. So what is it important for you to know? Well, nothing actually, because I don't know you and I'm not got a relationship with you, and you don't, you know, we're not connected. So I guess it's about framing it for that call. What would you really like to talk about today, or what would it be helpful to talk about today?
Yeah, that's a good one. What would be helpful for us to talk about today? That's a really good one, I think.
And you know what, if it is the washing, the shopping and Donald Trump, that's okay, because it still gives them the social connection.
Yes.
This isn't about you giving them answers or intervening particularly. Some people will naturally go more to trying to work out an issue and come up with a solution, but for some, they literally just want company.
What was that question again? That last one, it was really good. What would be helpful? Is that what that was?
Yeah, I always say these things and don't know what I've just said. What would it be helpful for us to talk about today? Or and you know, the closing one in terms of what was most important for you might be you know, a cheeky kind of reframe. Having spoken for the last 40 minutes or whatever it is, what are you going to go and do differently now to make yourself feel more relaxed, or to feel, what, it depends what's come up in the conversation, right? But you could do like almost an accountability. What are you going to go and do now to show yourself some self-care, or what are you going to do now to change how you're thinking about that, so that you begin to move them into that more positive frame of mind. I would say that last 5-10 minutes of the call is key, and how you leave them. What you don't want to do is leave them having just had a major release of negative emotion.
I guess I was sort of thinking about that a little bit too when you're talking about you know, that listening can make you feel good too. And I was thinking, if you're listening to some really horrible stuff, sometimes it could feel really heavy at the end of it and quite sad or depressing. And so that frame of how do you do it in such a way that you don't come away carrying someone's horrible life story.
Yeah, and I think we need to have a backup plan to that, that should someone get distressed as a listener, there's someone they can go to. And whether that ends up being me or Camilla, or, you know, somebody with a little bit more experience, I don't know. But I think that, yeah, we set that up, that if you are left disturbed by something that's been said. I worked for many years in an A&E department, and we used to get some really bizarre, disturbing calls. Now, these people are just coming in unfiltered, and you might get the odd person who is not a genuine person in need of care and comforting. So looking after the listeners as well, and having a go-to place for them should they need it for whatever reason, I think is a really good safety measure as well. But that breathing that we do kind of shields you. So if you go in with a really good, balanced, autonomic state, you're much less likely to be triggered or to come away with any negative emotion at the end of it. So taking that time, and it only takes 2 or 3 minutes before you start. You can do it while you're praying, as you go in. If you're feeling at all triggered all the way through, then just go back into that balanced breathing again. The other thing I guess that comes to mind is, how long do you talk to somebody for? How long's a piece of string? I know the lady that I spoke to the other day that I passed on to Lorraine, the first call I had with her was just going around in circles. So it was the same issue. Yeah, and it could have been like a 2-hour call. So it's about, how do you handle when you don't, not that you're trying to get anywhere, but you've had your conversation. How do you close it off in a polite way so that they don't feel all the good work's undone by then saying, well, you've had your time, I'm going now.
Well, now that you brought that up, that lady that I've been talking to, the same issue goes on and on and on. And the story is slightly different every time.
Yeah.
So I just said to her the other day, maybe it's time that we can move on from this. How do you think you can move on from this?
Nice.
Is that the right thing to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Did she respond to it?
Yeah, she did make a comment. And I haven't spoken to her in any length since then. I've had quick calls that she's done to me. I've had 2 calls from her. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, I've got you on fast dial. I didn't intend to ring you. And that was quite difficult for me to say, well, no. So I asked her, well, who it was she was looking for and what the question was. But, and she did say that the lady that was where these animals offered to take her back and to pat her sheep. So I thought the next time I talked to her, I might ask her if she went to pat the sheep.
Yeah. When you're in a very sympathetically dominated state, you don't have good access to your kind of decision-making area of your brain. And so you do get kind of caught in this loop of negative story. And it will change because you're not getting all the factual bits right. It will just change.
Right.
Whether or not they're ready to have that interrupted will vary person by person. If someone's coming to me for coaching, I feel like they've given me consent to interrupt those thinking patterns. But if someone's coming for listening, I haven't really got that same consent. I'm there to listen. And maybe that does mean I listen to the same story 5 times, but it probably doesn't mean I listen to it 15 or 20 times.
Yeah.
So it's about finding that mark of how often, how long, and them not becoming, it's back to that whole thing about relationship. In the befriending scheme that I belong to, we were like contracted for a set number of sessions. It was incredibly formal. So the person who I was a befriender to never had my personal contact details. All connection was through a coordinator. And they had 6 sessions with me. If they wanted to extend it, you could negotiate an extension to 12 sessions. But everybody knew what was expected. So we might at some point think about that in relation to this. Is it a never ending, she now has your number, she can ring you whenever she likes at whatever time of day or night? Or are there any boundaries to it?
Right.
It sounds like some structure would be helpful. Because,
absolutely.
I mean, part of your audience for today, Suzanne, are people that are caring for folk in the church family, and obviously a large part of your thinking is around how, those of us that are going to be contacted by people in the community as well.
Yep.
And I imagine that the need for structure is even greater where you're responding to people in the community, in terms of
absolutely.
what's appropriate, where the go zones and no go zones and that sort of stuff. So
yeah.
That might be something. Steve's not intending to put that in place. Maybe you and I could work around thinking some framework around some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it would be worth putting some clarity there so that we know what it is we're offering. Also, if we get to the point where more people need us and we need more volunteers, we know what we're asking people to do.
Yeah, that's good.
And that safety of, thinking about whether or not they do have your number. Very, very difficult on a mobile phone, because the minute you speak to them on the mobile phone, they have the number unless you withhold it.
That's right.
But it's just on the odd occasion where someone might misuse that number. Are we protecting the listener in the way that we've set the service up?
Sure. So at the moment, we're really just relying on the common sense and goodwill of Alison's, really.
Yeah.
But moving ahead, that needs to change, really.
Yeah, which is kind of fine within a church context, but we're now going out to complete unknowns and strangers.
Yeah.
And possibly in that is also that if you're putting out sort of guidelines ahead of time in the sense that they know what they're buying into, there's also that opportunity to say, should it become a conversation that needs more specialist support, then we will recommend or pass you on, you know, and that can be called kind of almost upfront as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it would be lovely to know who the local psychotherapists are, who the local counsellors are, who would be willing to be on a list. It would be a lovely kind of other outcome of this whole project of pulling in those sorts of people into the church network.
Because I've already have been approached by a woman in Laingholm who does couples counselling. So she's a retired couples counsellor. She's done a range of other things as well. But she's put her hat into the ring. I'm willing to make myself available. So it'd be really lovely to build those bridges with people like her.
Yeah, beautiful. And the medical networks, I mean, presumably you haven't got a GP practice out at Laingholm. I don't know of one. Do you all come into Titirangi?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just letting the GP practices know what we're doing and that service is there, so that if somebody comes into them repeatedly and actually they're just lonely, the GP practices know this is an option locally, that there is this kind of, support network available.
Citizen advice, knowing the citizen's advice or someone else, GP or, a JP or somebody else for different types of things as well, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think that the wider scheme by Steve does cover those other areas. We're just kind of talking kind of well-being one under this, but yeah, the support being offered by the whole hub is far wider than just well-being.
Yeah. Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm a really poor listener, unfortunately, I need to head off to something that I'm committed to doing next. So I just want to say, you might want to, I'm going to go and get that moving, but I just want to say thank you, Suzanne. You've definitely got me thinking about some new ways of opening up lines of listening in a conversation. Particularly for me, that one around balancing empathy with listening with people who are kind of in that really negative brain. So that's been really helpful. Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And thank you for just I can see you would have spent a lot of time just preparing for us today. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. I will stop the recording now.